Joining me now in the Cipher Brief studio is Nick Fishwick, former senior member of the British Foreign Office and a Cipher Brief expert. And Nick is joining us from the UK. Nick, it's always good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be talking to you.
You know, it's really nice to get some sort of expert perspective from outside the U.S. as we're just coming off the heels of this Munich Security Conference, which left so many European leaders sort of scratching their heads, dumbfounded, trying to figure out how much they're going to be able to rely on the U.S. in the future for security, given what's happening in Ukraine. So I want to start out by talking about this excellent column that you wrote that's published in the cipherbrief.com. The title of the column is "Trump is Giving Europe Its Turn to Lead," which I think kind of sums up how you feel. But you say in the piece, if the U.S. is stepping down from Ukraine, we Europeans have to step up. Talk to me about what that looks like for you.
Well, there's two elements to it, really. I mean, so number one is what looks like the Trump administration saying, you know, we want an end to this, and that means that more weight is going to have to be borne by the Europeans. That's one dimension to it. Two is, can Europe kind of respond to that implicit challenge? I think the first thing is, I can't imagine how anybody in Europe can be surprised by what's happened. I mean, you know, he was president for 4 years, just over 4 years ago. So we knew what to expect, and we've had lots of time to prepare for this. I think, to be fair, some of the European reaction to the latest developments over Ukraine over the last a week to 10 days suggests they actually have been thinking about this. But it should not be a great shock, and perhaps the European response to this suggests they have actually thought about what this might look like. But you've got the US taking what looks like we're out of here and we've got other strategic interests position, which to me doesn't mean that they're going to wash the hands of Europe. I don't panic and think that, you know, they're just going to leave us and leave Russia to kind of have a good time threatening us. I don't think it's going to be as simple as that, but it is going to be a different equation from what it was in the old kind of post-1945 days. And then there's a big challenge for Europe, which is, you know, we've been lucky since 1945 or so, or whenever NATO was formed shortly after that, in that the US is the kind of bedrock of NATO, particularly in the Cold War days, but since then as well, has given us a kind of security reinsurance. We've been very lucky to have it, you know, with America's amazing economic and military resources. You know, we're extremely lucky to have that keeping us secure. We had no reason necessarily to assume that it would be considered by every US president to be in America's strategic interest to keep propping us up. And let's remember, at the same time as the US was providing that support for Europe, a lot of European countries weren't pulling their weight. They weren't even spending the 2% they're supposed to be spending. I think some countries, even now, still haven't managed to hit that. So I can imagine the United States being a bit kind of unhappy with that. Whatever, it looks to me as if we've now got to not only think about what not a post-US NATO in Europe would look like, but a different type of US support for NATO in Europe would look like, and then do it. I think, as I say, I think there's evidence that some of the thinking actually has been going on, you know, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in other countries. But the tricky thing after doing the thinking and agreeing what it's going to look like is doing it. You can't just kind of build, you know, a defense industry or an army and resource an army in like 3 weeks. I mean, it does take a bit of time, and there's a slightly scary gap between what the US is doing now and what the Europeans might be capable of doing to deter Russia. What is that gap going to look like, and how can we make that as unthreatening to us as possible?
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky obviously not happy with the way things are developing at all. He is calling for an army of Europe. What does that mean to you, and do you think it's feasible?
Well, it looks to me as if the sort of settlement that we're going to be looking at in Ukraine, and I can understand why President Zelensky, who is, I think, a fantastically admirable and brave European leader, I can see why he's going to be unhappy about the way things look to be developing. But it looks to me as if what could be an acceptable, if challenging, outcome would be, the Russians get what they've stolen for the time being. There's a ceasefire, and then we work to integrate Ukraine into a European defence system. They're not going to go into NATO because it's been made quite clear by the Russians, interestingly, that they can envisage Ukraine going into the European Union, which I thought had been a red line, but now doesn't seem to be. Nice to know that 5 years after the war started, 3 years after the war started. But if that's not a spoiler, that's actually very, very encouraging, as long as pro-Russian European Union states can be persuaded to let Ukraine in. Now, on the military side, I think we're looking at, I hope, although it will be a stretch, some European boots on the ground in Ukraine, strengthening the message to Putin that he doesn't go any further. And if he does, he's facing big trouble. European and maybe other support for Ukraine to develop its indigenous military industrial capacity, and basically building up fortress Ukraine, so that even if Putin is tempted to push further west than the ceasefire lines are at the moment, and then the ceasefire lines will be assumed to be as a result of whatever deal this is, he can't do it. It'll be too much of a risk for him, and we need something like that in the Baltics and Poland as well. I think the parts of Europe that are most threatened by Russian unpredictability and aggression. I think this. I don't know the details of as to how this would work and how this would be finessed with NATO. I've been very interested in what the NATO Secretary General has been saying about the need for, kind of updated defence architecture. I think he's right, and it suggests to me that he's been thinking about this. So somehow that deterrent line, in a way, a bit like the Warsaw Pact NATO line of before 1989, but obviously in slightly different places, it has to be built and reinforced and solid, and the Russians must know it's a red line beyond which they must not go.
Yeah. I think it's worth reminding people every once in a while, Nick, too, about the threat that Russia poses to Europe. We know the threat Russia is posing to Ukraine, but you've written several pieces actually in the Cipher Brief over the last year or so that really detail why Russia is seen as a potential threat to Europe. The Baltics, which you've mentioned, there are gray zone operations going on there all the time. Efforts at disinformation, always concerns about election interference in European countries. What am I missing in terms of why Russia is so concerning to European leaders?
Well, I don't know what you're missing. I mean, I think you listed quite a lot of nasty things that they're doing. I guess the point I've been trying to make over the last year or so is that we are effectively at war with Russia, and I don't think this deal is going to end that war. Now, it's not a legal war. Sir Keir Starmer hasn't, and his successors didn't either, sort of made a formal declaration of war with Russia. But in practice, diplomatic relations are for basically care and maintenance. Trade is down. Now, there may be sanctions lifting as a result of this deal, but still, trade is not going to recover to where it was in the 90s or the noughties, I don't think. Trust is zero. So, the way you talk to any Western leader, you talk to any Western person who's thought about Putin, how do they rate Putin as a trustworthy partner now compared to 20 years ago? Absolutely incomparably lower. We know that Russia is doing all those things that you talked about, Suzanne. So they are interfering in elections. They're killing people. They're trying to kill people as they try to kill somebody and then mistakenly killed somebody else in Britain in 2018. They're doing that. They still have an essentially zero-sum view of European relations. I wouldn't dignify it with the term international relations, i.e. anything bad that happens to our values has got to be good for their values. So this is all, a dying regime at loggerheads with us and our values, and I can't see that ceasing to be anything other than a conflict. Now, I don't want that to be a military conflict, but because Russia is basically fighting these battles with us, in the space of legal and constitutional freedoms, in the space of, using criminal tactics to murder people, in terms of cyber attacks and cyber pressure on us, cyber espionage, this to me amounts to, it isn't a Cold War, but it's a kind of non-military war. And if they want to fight it, we've got to fight it back. And the point I've been trying to make is, although it's an uncomfortable position for us now, if we're looking at an American presidency that wants to withdraw its commitments in Europe, and we can't just turn them on like that, we've got to do that. And we are capable of doing it. We're much richer than Russia. We're much more creative. We're technologically ahead of them. If we have the political willpower on a sustained basis to gear up for this conflict, we can't lose it.
Let me ask you, though, Nick, is Europe politically and militarily capable of building a continental army?
Again, how you build an army, I don't know. Sadly, nobody's ever asked me to establish an army, and that's very good news for European security. So I don't know how you'd actually do that, and I don't know how NATO or the military related to NATO would do that. In terms of
you think the political will might be there in order to do it?
Yeah, I think that's what was behind your question, which I do have views on.
Yeah.
It's never been more difficult for us because, you could say that before, 1989, we didn't worry about Hungary because they were on the other side, and they were actually a worry for the Russians at that point. Now that they're a worry for us. Mm-hmm. Slovakia is a worry for us, and potentially electoral outcomes in other countries could be a worry for us as well, because I would never have expected, 15 years ago that there'd be the degree of pro-Russian sentiment in European democracies as there is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. On the other side, elections happen, and it may well be that pro-Russian regimes in some of these countries can get democratically overthrown at the ballot box. It could also be, I hope, that regardless of that, the imperative to protect the Baltic states, the imperative to protect Poland, and let's remember that if the Russians really want to threaten them, they are threatening countries that are already in NATO. That would be a pretty wacky thing to do, and it would automatically trigger a response. Mm-hmm. So, our military capabilities, they have that NATO umbrella, and I think it's a question of making sure that our own indigenous European capabilities are strong enough to make that umbrella watertight.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about as Europe kind of figures out its own security footing now, given the mood, the tone of the new administration. I want to ask you something else that you wrote about in this piece, Nick, just in closing, because I feel like it's an important point that not a lot of people are talking about right now. And what we've seen over the past 3 years now, as we look at the 3-year mark of the anniversary of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, to be fair, the China relationship, the relationship between Beijing and Moscow has only gotten closer. And you say, when you're talking about, you're referring to in the piece, the deal that will certainly be done, we don't know what's going to be in it, over ending the war in Ukraine. You say, if the deal that the U.S. does with Russia on Ukraine is a sellout of Ukraine, and it may not be, you're careful to say, that is great news for China as potential leader of the new world order. Why should the U.S., Europe not take their eye off China in all of this?
I mean, China is a way more powerful and interesting global power than, say, somewhere like Russia. China, as we've discussed before, it's here to stay, and the West, including the US, including the UK, has got to think of a way of living with China, and there are entirely conceivable outcomes in that which are fine for us, and fine for the Chinese people, and fine for the world. Fine for global trade, fine for global peace. That's entirely achievable in a way that I just can't see it being achievable for the Putin regime. But it's been pretty clear that China, I think, I don't think President Xi is noted for his sense of humour, but I think he has been probably quite enjoying the pain that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused us, number one. And number two, I think he's enjoyed this moving Russia to a state of dependency on him. I think he's enjoyed both of these things. And if he had a sense of humour, he'd be having quite a laugh about both things. If an outcome of this illegal and bloodthirsty Russian invasion is to give Russia quite a lot of what it wants, and more importantly, in a way, to signal that America's not prepared to go that far, really. And America is what perhaps some of us had feared, becoming an isolationist power and transactional in its approach. That's got to be good for the global power of China. I mean, I think America's got to ask itself, does it really think that it can be the same sort of hitter in global geopolitics if it takes an isolationist approach? I just don't see how it can, and that's got to be good news for China. So I think China will assume, right, okay, our reading of American reactions suggests that perhaps they're not going to be quite so keen on defending Taiwan as, say, President Biden's statement suggested a couple of years ago. Perhaps Trump is completely different, and they'll be quite tolerant about that. We can keep pressing into the South China Sea, and if America's going kind of isolationist and all excited about tariffs and protectionist, I understand the argument they're just using that to obtain outcomes from countries who dare to disagree with them. But, again, that's going to be good news for China in terms of running a global economic system that's in their interest. So I can see lots of things that President Xi is going to think is great. And I don't think China, I think it's sensible to see China as a kind of black and white bad actor. But its values are fundamentally not those of the West, and I don't like the values that President Xi has. And I think increased Chinese global influence is going to be no good for anybody, and it won't be good for the US, and it won't be sustainable for the US just to be isolationist.
Yeah, I think it's more than obvious on the world stage at the moment how interconnected all of these relationships are, and how all of them, every single move on the chessboard that we see daily now, it feels like, is leading toward future security and has an impact on future security. Nick Fishwick, former senior member of the British Foreign Office. We're proud to call you a Cipher Brief expert as well. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Suzanne.